Good afternoon, friends. Thank you so much for coming to the ISAS seminar today on building trade integration amongst the Indian Ocean Rim Association states, the IORA states, the challenges and opportunities in that regard. And the speaker today, a very eminent trade economist and professional, Professor Peter Draper. He's the Executive Director for the Institute for International Trade, University of Adelaide in Australia. Now, before I introduce Professor Draper, let me just share with you a couple of thoughts on this particular subject and the interest that the Institute of South Asian Studies has in this. For a very long period of time, from a geo-economic, I'm not too sure about the geopolitical part, but as an economic, I can connect more on the geo-economic side. The Indian Ocean has been a bit of a vague region, if one can describe it that way, from an economic perspective, in the sense that the Indian Ocean was always there in geography. The Indian Ocean was a very prominent body of water when it came to geography in terms of the connection between the two hemispheres. But it was never really very deeply analyzed as a region or as a space in terms of the amount of economic synergies, economic opportunities, or even economic complications that it can produce. And one of the reasons for that, maybe Professor Draper will reflect on it, is the fact that the Indian Ocean region, unlike other maritime spaces, some other maritime spaces of the world, has never really ever been within the turf of a particular regional architecture. That regional architecture has been largely missing from the Indian Ocean region, and to what extent the IORA might be able to provide a sufficient alternative in that regard is an issue. But more specifically, coming to contemporary developments, from a South Asian perspective, it probably required the development of two specific, I would say, interventions in the Indian Ocean region to capture attention on that. The first was the fact that China started moving into the Indian Ocean region very actively, not just in terms of kind of a low-profile military presence, if one can describe it that way, but also more specifically in terms of connectivity plans like the Belt and Road Initiative, which very specifically as an economic geography brought the Indian Ocean region into very sharp focus, making prominent Indian Ocean countries like India sit up and take notice of the fact that there is, so as to say, the extra-regional actor which is very active around it. There's a certain economic geography shaping around it, and that requires a clear, cohesive understanding of what the Indian Ocean is all about and what it contains and what it might mean in terms of future connectivity goals and designs. Around this time, probably as a reaction or not as a reaction, even as an autonomous path, there was the development of the strategic concept of Indo-Pacific. And the Indo-Pacific, much as it has been articulated variously before it was prominently put out by the US administration under Mr. Trump, there were allusions to this approach before, primarily by none other than the Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, who articulated about this in a speech which it delivered in 2008 to a joint session of the Indian Parliament. But thereafter, today the Indo-Pacific is not just the flavor of the season, it's a current narrative, it's an active strategic concept, and it exists as much around the Indian Ocean as it does on the Pacific, probably much more on the Indian Ocean. And the entire discussion around Indo-Pacific and its structural construct is probably coming out of the fact that the Indian Ocean lacks a regional construct. Those regional constructs are more prominently visible across the Pacific, but whether those Pacific constructs can be extended across the Indian Ocean into meaningful economic architectures that are able to absorb the economic dimensions of the two oceans connecting to each other is a challenge. We do have at this stage a lot of interest in looking closely at the Indian Ocean Ream Association membership. The Indian Ocean Ream comprises very significant countries, including major countries like Australia, Indonesia, India, and a large number of other countries. We are actually in a position to look at this very closely only through very detailed and rigorous analysis of a series of relationships across the Indian Ocean region, where the economic relationship is not exclusive of the geopolitical and strategic ties of the region. Professor Draper has been involved in a very exhaustive exercise in this regard, which is kind of being ordained by the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, if I can put it that way, of the government of Australia. And we are lucky to have him with us here today. He's transiting between Bangkok and Adelaide. And thank you, Peter, for spending some time with us. And let me just have the pleasure of briefly reading out your very illustrious bio profile. He is right now the Executive Director of the Institute for International Trade in the Faculty of the Professions at the University of Adelaide. He is a member of the Board of Trustees of the International Chamber of Commerce's Research Foundation. He is a non-resident senior fellow of the Brussels-based European Center for International Political Economy. He is an associated researcher at the German Development Institute and a board member of the Australian Services Roundtable. He is the recipient of an honorary doctorate degree from the Friedrich-Schiller-University in Germany. For about a decade, he was member, chair, vice chair, and co-chair of the World Economic Forum's Global Future Council on the Global Trade and the FDI System, and he was also a senior research fellow at the South African Institute of International Affairs. He worked in South Africa's National Department of Trade and Industry in bilateral economic relations with a particular focus on East Asia and the Mercosur group of countries. He was also the head of the Economic Analysis and Research Unit in the DTI's International Trade and Economic Development Division. And prior to that, he was an academic teaching economic history and political economy and head of the Department of Economics and Economic History at the then University of Durban-Westville, now University of KwaZulu-Natal. On a friendly, lighter note, I'm very happy to have somebody sitting to my right who has almost as schizophrenic a CV that I have, having crossed between civil services to academics, except in the opposite direction. You're in academics and then you move to civil service and probably now coming back. I did it the other way around. So welcome, Peter. And the floor is all yours. And we normally have a practice of the speaker speaking here for about 35 to 40 minutes. And then we open up the floor for discussion. Thank you so much.
Well, thanks very much, Amitendo, and thanks very much for the invitation to be here today. It's a great pleasure to visit ISAS and to be able to give this talk. As Amitendo mentioned, this is partly work in progress for the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. So some initial thoughts, if you like. The research is a bit further advanced than that, but I need to be a little bit careful about what I say because it hasn't yet been publicly released. So you get a sneak preview today of some of the insights that we're coming up with. Having said that, and before I get into the structure of the talk, IORA, the Indian Ocean Rim Association, is still a fairly nascent organization for those that have some exposure to it. So thinking about a trade agenda for IORA is a bit of a challenging proposition for reasons that I hope will become fairly apparent as I proceed. So a presentation in 4 parts. I thought I'd start with a bit more on the strategic context. So Amitendo has sketched some of that, and I'll speak to some of those dynamics. And I think we're very much in agreement on the broad framing which Amitendo has already given. In the report that we're preparing, there is a lot of emphasis on the data, the numbers. I'm not going to present too much of that today. I think that would be quite challenging to absorb. So just a few selected key charts to give a sense of the proposition, if you like, of an IORA trade agenda. So what are the trade dynamics we can associate with the membership of IORA? And for reasons that will become apparent, you'll note that I'm not talking about the IORA region, because I don't believe there is an IORA region. Then I'll zoom in a little bit into the trade facilitation area, because this does seem to be the most promising area for cooperation amongst IORA member states and for support from outside the IORA membership. And I'll end with one slide that tries to bring it all together and present some trade integration options for IORA members. So starting with the strategic context, and I thought I'd start with this map, which I do not claim to have developed. This comes from a report by David Brewster at Australian National University called Australia's Second Ocean. So this is very much from an Australian perspective, his report is. And basically what he is showing in this map is a mapping of key shipping routes across the Indian Ocean. The key takeaways here are that blue and green essentially represent minerals, oil, and gas. So now we've got two screens, so this could be a bit challenging, but if I go on this side, a lot of minerals exported, particularly from Africa, going into the broader East Asian economies, fueling China particularly, but also Japan's industrial machinery. A lot of oil and gas from the Gulf region, transiting all the way through into East Asia, down into Australia as well. And of course minerals, gas, etc., going from Australia in the opposite direction and into East Asia. The bottom line being that much of the trade that transits the Indian Ocean is centered on energy, minerals, commodities. There is some container traffic, and that is principally concentrated in the northern part, transiting the Bay of Bengal. And that obviously connects European markets to East Asian markets and production zones. But it's largely absent from the western part of the Indian Ocean and the southeastern part centered on Australia, which are really commodity exporters. Nonetheless, if you're a naval strategist looking at this map, what jumps out at you is the importance of energy flows and energy lines, but also security of supply of commodities and a range of key commodities. And this is why I think the concept of the Indo-Pacific has really come to the fore recently. It's first and foremost about securing flows or shipping lanes for flows of energy, minerals, etc. That said, the Indian Ocean Rim Association is not the right forum for dealing with those issues because it's an economic cooperation grouping. There is another grouping called the Indian Ocean Naval Symposium, which, as I understand it, I don't know much about it, is convened by India, and that brings together all the littoral states bordering, if you like, the Indian Ocean into this grouping where they discuss naval issues. Now, this second map is taken from a report that the Commonwealth of Australia, the Parliament of Australia, produced in 2013. And there was an inquiry at the time into what Australia's interests are in the Indian Ocean, which subsequently gave rise to Australia's version of the Indo-Pacific strategy, which I'll get to shortly. I'm not going to go into any detail on this map. I think you can see just by looking at it that it's complex. The bottom line being that there are many sub-regions within, if there is one, a broader Indian Ocean region. But as I just showed you from those trade connections, the shipping routes, talking of an Indian Ocean region is a challenging notion, and that's essentially what the report came up with. They said it's very difficult to identify an Indian Ocean region. Rather, there's a series of systems and subsystems within a geographic space that is the Indian Ocean. And moreover, that space includes a number of dysfunctional states as well as conflict zones. Now, if those states are in your cooperation institution, it makes it difficult to forge meaningful pacts and cooperation arrangements. And that certainly characterizes IORA. I'm not sure to what extent it also characterizes the IONS. The bottom line for me, being focused on trade, this last bullet, is which of these sub-regions matter most for building a trade integration agenda. And I wouldn't pretend actually to have the answer, so I'm really just posing the question. Moving to Australia's interests, which is the left-hand chart. I think the right-hand chart will be very familiar. So this is, if you like, Australia's conception of the Indo-Pacific. Let me try to use the mouse here. Right. So I'm based in Adelaide, which is down here. Perth is very much on the Indian Ocean, but most of Australia's population and economic activity sits on the Pacific seaboard, which is why the Pacific part of the Indo-Pacific looms so large in Australia's thinking about the Indo-Pacific. But if we switch back to the Indian Ocean part, it's really the Bay of Bengal and the Arabian Sea that loom large in Australia's security conception of the Indo-Pacific. But what's evident from that map is that it doesn't go around the entire Indian Ocean rim. So it doesn't traverse a lot of that trade and that connectivity that I put up earlier. So the entire eastern seaboard of Africa is missing. And actually there is quite significant investment from Australia into the eastern seaboard of Africa. I would add that from an Indian perspective, since we're at the Institute of South Asian Studies, there's significant Indian investment and trade with the eastern states of Africa as well. Which then leads me to the right-hand chart, which is we need a broader conception of the Indo-Pacific. So China certainly has this. That's what this map is showing. This is broadly China's BRI concept, and China, as we all know, has been a huge investor into Africa and is constructing a large number of ports, railroads, gas pipelines, etc. across the eastern African seaboard, right the way down into southern Africa. Which then, and it's not just China, Japan also has a broader conception of the Indo-Pacific, which includes the eastern coastline of Africa. So does the US, both the security concepts and the trade concepts. So certainly from an Australian perspective, what we're saying is if you're going to develop a trade agenda for IORA, it needs to go beyond the security framing of the Indo-Pacific. And then this chart I found quite interesting. So if we think about RCEP, well, we know that India hasn't yet come on board. I assume it's just a matter of time before India does come on board. Maybe Avantendra has more insight into that, but I think that's likely to be the case. But basically the point that I would like to make from this chart is that it's just a matter of time before China starts seeking deeper trade integration, particularly with East Africa, given the minerals and the commodities it is sourcing from those states. But it's not only China. The European Union already has a series of what they call economic partnership agreements in place right across the entire African continent. And there's a range of other states on the Indian Ocean littoral that have an interest in what happens on the African side of the Indian Ocean. And so the question then becomes, once RCEP is cemented, what next, particularly for those states that are directly involved in the Indian Ocean, and I think particularly of India, Southeast Asia, Australia. So how do they build connectivity to the western part, i.e. to Africa and the Middle East? So this then, to bring the focus back to IORA, is mapping the IORA member states. A couple of interesting things jump out. So firstly is the number of states that are not Asian. So a number of Middle Eastern as well as African states. But also some obvious missing states, and this speaks to IORA's politics. So the obvious missing ones: Myanmar, Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, and France. France actually has a department in the Indian Ocean, which is Réunion, the island of Réunion. The Indian Ocean Naval Symposium, so this is the structure that focuses on naval cooperation, does include all of these states. Now, if any state would be, or any organization would be a little bit worried about security issues and the politics of security issues, it should be the IONS. So why are these member states not included in IORA? For me, that's an obvious problem. All right, so that was to set the scene in terms of the strategic dynamics that IORA finds itself in. I'm now going to move into the trade dynamics and throw up a series of charts that sketch out different dimensions of it. But first, to set the scene, some summary observations. So the first point, there is growing market potential in the IORA region. India looms particularly large within that for obvious reasons. But it's not just an Indian story. If one thinks of the East African community, for instance, countries whose economies are growing very rapidly, but from a small base, with large and rapidly growing populations. So the market proposition is rising, and not just in Eastern Africa. Generally speaking, though, when we map the trade performance of IORA members in the aggregate against global norms and comparator regions, the IORA region doesn't stack up particularly well, but it doesn't do too badly either. So it's not a particularly dynamic part of global trade, but it is improving. That's particularly true when it comes to global value chains. And in this part of the world, we know, if you want to incorporate trade dynamism, you need to be integrated into global value chains. But by and large, many of the states that comprise IORA's membership are not particularly well integrated into global value chains, and certainly not when it comes to what the Chinese call processing trade. So fabrication for export, manufacturing trade particularly. So if we go back to that map of the trade flows, largely commodities, minerals, energy flows that characterize the trade, not manufacturing per se. But there are some encouraging signs. So one of the exercises we did is we mapped imports and exports of parts and components, and we find there's an increasing dynamism in that dimension of IORA members' trade. However, if you strip out Southeast Asian members of IORA, it diminishes quite rapidly. So it is still largely centered on Southeast Asia. And then the final point I'd like to make is about the dialogue partners. So Amitendru mentioned a couple. So China is a dialogue partner of the IORA, the Indian Ocean Rim Association. So is Japan, the US, a number of European countries. There's 4 altogether now, and they're the obvious ones: the UK, Germany, France, Italy just joined last month. And then South Korea, and there's one other that escapes me for the moment. But when you go back and map the IORA member states' individual trade flows across the IORA region, i.e. with other IORA members, and then with the dialogue partners, it's the dialogue partners generally that loom large. So IORA members tend to trade more outside the IORA space than they do within the IORA space. And that's perhaps an obvious point, but still needs to be remembered. Okay, so a couple of charts that go towards, first of all, consumption potential and market size. So what we're showing in this first chart is electricity access, connecting populations to the electricity grid, which then enables a whole range of consumption patterns. And it's growing very rapidly in the IORA region. And I suspect that's largely a South Asian phenomenon, but it's also increasingly an African phenomenon as well. But of course there are regional variations, so what the chart at the bottom is showing is just disaggregating IORA member states into sub-regions. So East Africa, the Gulf, Oceania, which is Australia really, South Asia, Southeast Asia, and the Southern African region. And there's quite a lot of variation in the growth stories across these regions. But the ones that really have stood out are Southeast Asia, South Asia to a lesser extent, and increasingly actually East Africa, so that East African story I was talking about. What this chart is doing, and this was an exercise performed by the Australian Chamber of Commerce and Industry, which is very interested in the IORA possibility, I would say. It's showing GDP sizes now, well actually in 2018, so it's latest available data, and then projecting those out to 2030, so straight line projections. And if we take this as a cutoff point here, is essentially a group of states that stand out. So I've just listed them on the right-hand side, so India, Bangladesh, which we know is growing rapidly as well, the Southeast Asian IORA members, Australia, which is already a relatively large economy, the United Arab Emirates, and South Africa. So in terms of IORA's market potential, it's concentrated in these states and regions. And the question we are interested in, but don't necessarily have an answer for, is are these the key gateway economies? And a gateway economy, by my definition, is a country or a region that connects its hinterland to the world and the world to the hinterland. And our thinking is if you can connect these gateway regions to each other across the Indian Ocean, that's how you will build ultimately a trade integration project with some meaning. It'll be built around these anchor states. Now that's a challenging proposition to put to a multilateral grouping, because they're going to say you can't favor this country or that, it's got to be for all. But at the end of the day, if you're going to build viable integration, there has to be a core to it. That is our view. This is a very busy table, but basically what it is showing in the highlighted parts is firstly intra-IORA trade, and broken down by those major sub-regions that I showed you earlier. So basically Australia, which was the first one, doesn't trade much with other IORA states. Southeast Asia, about just over a quarter of its trade is with other IORA members. South Asia, which includes India, Bangladesh, and Sri Lanka, about a quarter as well. Africa less, and the Middle East even less. This is the trade with the dialogue partners on the other side, and clearly the dialogue partners loom much larger. And generally this would be a story, certainly when it comes to the African case, the Middle Eastern case as well, and Oceania or Australia, of exporting minerals, commodities, etc., and importing advanced manufacturers. I won't go too much into the details of this slide, but what we were also doing in this report is trying to get a sense of value chain integration. So where are different countries located in global value chains? Are they, if you like, at the source in terms of supplying commodities into value chains, so they export raw materials? Or are they somewhere in between, perhaps a little bit like Singapore, which is at the center of the Southeast Asian and broader East Asian processing trade? So Singapore is particularly well integrated in a forward sense. Or is it something else? And by and large, what we found across the IORA membership, with the exception of Singapore and other Southeast Asian states, is they are characterized by forward integration. In other words, they supply predominantly raw materials, energy, etc., into global markets, particularly East Asian markets. But that doesn't necessarily mean you're doomed not to develop. And the Australian case really bears that out. So Australia exports a lot of raw materials and resources, but it's still a wealthy country because it has built up strong institutions over time. So moving on to IORA's trade facilitation performance, but maybe just going back and thinking about this, it's difficult to conceive of a regional integration project where intra-regional trade levels are low and generally characterized by exporting commodities outside of your region and not trading much in terms of value-added products within the region. So it's going to be challenging to build a viable regional integration project on that platform. Hence we thought, let's look at trade facilitation. So maybe the focus of the IORA membership should be on just getting rid of the egregious barriers to trade. And so to get at that, we looked at the Trade Facilitation Agreement that was, well, not so recently concluded by WTO members, World Trade Organization members. And we wanted to get a sense of the extent to which it's being implemented across the IORA membership. And this is obviously of great interest to business, and if business gets on board and gets behind bedding down the Trade Facilitation Agreement, then you're more likely to have a sustainable momentum behind a trade integration project. That was the thinking. So I actually presented some of this data in Durban at a meeting of the Indian Ocean Rim Association Business Forum. So what the first part of the exercise was to run the data. Again, apologies for that, we're economists. So this is based on the OECD's trade facilitation indicators. To the left-hand side of the diagram, a country is doing well. So Singapore is tops, Australia close behind, and Mauritius not far behind that. So these are countries that score well in terms of lower barriers to trade in a trade facilitation sense. If I pick out the South Asian members, it's not such a good story, but India roundabout in the middle, Sri Lanka and Bangladesh not doing so well. Then what we did in this chart is to ask which are the members at or near best practice in terms of trade facilitation. So this is the best practice in at least one area. And there are no South Asian members that are at best practice in terms of the OECD data, which is probably the most comprehensive database on this subject. India is close to best practice in a couple of areas. And I'll just skip over the detail, but most IORA members are pretty far from best practice when it comes to trade facilitation. So that points to a range of institutional governance, etc., problems when it comes to the management of trade. So border agencies, online systems, etc., etc. So that obviously inhibits their connectivity to the world, but to other IORA members, which is our focus. And then in terms of making commitments on trade facilitation under the Trade Facilitation Agreement, there's quite a sharp drop-off, as you can see. But the way the Trade Facilitation Agreement works is that developing countries, and particularly least developed countries, are not obliged to take on as many commitments as developed countries. So on the left-hand side, Australia and Singapore, which acts as a developed country in the WTO, have fully implemented all of their commitments up front, so 100% implementation rate, and then it drops off fairly sharply after that. If we then broke that down into developing countries versus least developed country members of IORA, and this was done in June, so whoops, the picture might have changed a little bit since we ran this data, but not much, I suspect. So there's India. I don't want to get into too much detail, but basically if you break down the Trade Facilitation Agreement into 3 annexes, A, B, and C. Annex A, you implement all your commitments immediately up front. Annex B, you've got a phase-in period. And then Annex C, those are commitments that are linked to flows of aid for trade or funding support. So you would, in other words, we need to be paid to implement that commitment. And that applies particularly to least developed countries, which is why on this side of the chart you'll find Tanzania with a lot of annex, or actually those are not yet notified commitments, but yeah, Madagascar, sorry, with a lot of Annex C commitments. In other words, they're saying, we're prepared to reform, but first pay us the money, and then we'll reform. Yeah. So quite a long way to go in terms of some of the developing country members. So Sri Lanka, for instance, stands out here as having a number of Category C commitments. India, a lot of Category B, so they will implement, but in a reasonably short period of time. So that's for all the data. One more slide on what are the options for building trade integration in this very disparate non-region, if you like. So for me, two key things stand out. So firstly, we have to identify a region beyond the security imperatives. If we just focus on the security imperatives, we'll pretty much stop from an Australian perspective at the Arabian Sea and not encompass the African littoral and the Middle Eastern part either. Why would you want to do that? Not just from an Australian perspective. It's because there are economic diversification opportunities. And it's no secret that it is now a priority, I think, not just of the Australian government, but many other governments to diversify beyond China. Australia is very reliant on trade with China. So India looms large within that framework, but not just India. It should be beyond that, is the argument we're making. So tapping into that East African states' growth potential, which is admittedly a medium to long-term perspective. Some countries, particularly Mauritius, are advocating a grand IORA free trade agreement. Open regionalism, if you like, APEC style, is another potential option. We think that's pretty ambitious and premature. So we'd rather focus on those gateway economies and connecting the gateway economies. That's a difficult sell to the IORA membership, because then you're singling particular countries out. Below that, which is the final part, we think the IORA members need to focus on building value chains connectivity and building up intra-regional trade. So that's the trade facilitation agenda, as I've just indicated, but it's also about engaging trade reform debates. And that's another whole subject that we can perhaps pick up in the conversation. On that, there's scope for working with the dialogue partners that also want to support trade reform processes and have an interest in supporting trade reform processes. And then using that to build capacity of IORA members to plug into global value chains. Last but not least, we also highlight that we need to keep the WTO in sight. If the WTO is not functioning, if it disintegrates, it's bad for everyone. And so we think the IORA member states also need to engage in that conversation. And that's my story.
Thank you, Peter. That was very illustrative, and in fact, a large number of issues raised, a large number of, I would say, concerns focused upon, and maybe pointing to more questions than answers being provided, which of course is the way the state of the play is. So having said that, let me just now invite questions from the floor, and I would request you to kindly identify yourself before asking a question. So anybody who wants to go in first? Sure. Yeah.
My name is Chan from ISS. I'm just quite intrigued by the statistics that you showed based on the indicators and all on these IORA countries. So I'm just wondering, because these are empirical findings of what's the trade barriers and so forth, but let's say in the absence of the IORA organization at all, do you think that these empirical findings that we have just presented is still intact, in such a way? Because I'm I personally am seeing a lot of regional arrangements coming up now and then. I just wondering how the effects of these regional bodies affect these empirical findings. Thanks.
Would you like to collect a few questions or
Yeah.
let them go one by one? Okay.
Thanks, Yusuf. Hi, thank you, Peter. If I may put on the hat of a skeptic here, let's say I'm coming in from my name is Dipinder, I work at the Institute. So if I'm looking at it from let's say, a sovereign analyst, my instinctive response is this is a mesh you're putting upon a region which subsumes a huge number of regional arrangements driven by geopolitical exigencies and direct economic interests, like you pointed out. In ASEAN is fairly well integrated within GVCs. Australia's got deep primary resource links with China, and likewise in the Gulf, though they are diversified. What's the rationale for IORA? You've spoken of gateways, but it still sounds, again, I'm being skeptical. It sounds like a bit of a pie in the sky, really. I mean, in other words, for an economist, can you discern a compelling rationale or compelling argument to take it further? Anything that wouldn't go beyond. So given the wide disparities across the states, both in development and trade interests, would it make more sense and hope for a regeneration of multilateral talks and use that rubric to proceed further? Thanks.
We can probably take another question before Peter comes in. Yeah, Karthik.
Hi, Peter. Thank you for that. My name is Karthik Nachipun. I'm a research fellow here at ISAS. In terms of, so I'm looking at geopolitical leadership amongst the IORA. Which country do you think can step up and drive some of the heavy burden lifting here? Would it be Indonesia? And I see there's a lot of activity within Indonesia to take some sort of a leadership role in IORA, particularly on the trade and integration side. And just another question, how does digital trade fit into this this map that you've laid out? You didn't really speak much about that. And as certain parts of the region digitizes rapidly, that's going to dominate flows of trade and capital and investment. And how do you think that'll, that maps onto the IORA the question that you've laid out? Thanks.
Sir, excuse me, sir, you wanted a question?
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you, Pierre, for such a wonderful presentation. My name is Akinremi Bolaji. I'm the High Commissioner of Nigeria, and I'm very glad I'm participating in this. Thank you for also giving us a very clear view about Africa's involvement in this. But in my perception, don't you think the idea of including Africa is extending the frontier of the originally membership of the India-Pacific Ocean into the African space? And do you think this is really what Africa needs now, considering the fact of so much inequality and underdevelopment in Africa? What specific or strategic importance is this to Africa, knowing that there are other sub-regional organizations that takes care of security of the, particularly the India-Atlantic Ocean, and some other things that IORA takes care of. So it's a bit not focusing on what each region needs, understanding the fact that each region needs to develop at their own pace. And when you pay attention to what is so important to a particular place, do you think that membership or that partnership is equal? It seems to me that there is no rationale or basis for equality in this matter. So it's a kind of another scrambling for Africa, and eventually Africa might be left poorer than it is. I can't see anything in some of these things that takes care of specific Africa's need. Thank you.
Many thanks. Maybe Peter, now time for you to jump into the
Sure.
frying pan.
Great questions and comments. So the effect of regional bodies in terms of driving the data. I don't think IORA as a body drives any of the data that I've put forward. The data exists despite IORA, if you like, precisely because there isn't a region, and I think I was quite clear about that. In my view, there isn't an IORA region. So in this report, as we wrote it, we were very deliberately saying IORA member states, not the IORA region. So that Australian Commonwealth map that I put up, I think really tells the story of all the sub-regions and what a plethora of organizations and different groups there is within this. Nonetheless, our task was to try and make some sense of this, and the only way I think to make sense of it is from the geostrategic perspective that Ametendu laid out earlier. And I guess to some extent this gets to the High Commissioner's point. So I think whether African states like it or not, the rest of the world will find Africa. So the Belt and Road Initiative has already landed in the eastern part of Africa. The Japanese have been present in African states for many decades. The Europeans are very well entrenched and have these economic partnership agreements. I think Nigeria stayed out of their economic partnership agreement with Europe, but a number of other African countries have signed, if not implemented, those economic partnership agreements. The US is not far behind. They're looking now for partners to negotiate free trade agreements with. I would have thought both Indonesia and India have the same interests. So it's coming, whether we like it or not. The next question is that good or bad? And I think that comes back to a debate that I skipped around, which is your view on the role of trade integration in broader economic development. I'm much more positive about that, but there is a debate. So if you think that trade integration is bad or inimical for development, then you will take the view that we should put the barriers up and resist. It's not the view I take, but I think that's a much longer debate that we could have. But absolutely, yes, the skeptics would look at this IORA group and say, well, what's the cohesiveness here? And it's very difficult to see what that cohesiveness is outside of the context of key states looking to drive their projects. And I think within the IORA group, that is these gateway economies. Now, where does leadership come from? That's a good question. I would have thought India particularly, to the extent that India values integration across the IORA, there I'm saying it, the IORA region space, let me call it that. Certainly India has to be one of the key drivers, and it has been pretty active, per my understanding. Indonesia is showing more and more interest, and from what I've read recently, there is a discussion between Indonesia and the East African community about a free trade or a possible free trade agreement. In our advice to the Australian government, we're also saying, yes, you should want to build the grouping, IORA, that's important, but you've seen the disparate nature of the grouping, so you've got to focus on cross-cutting issues like trade facilitation, where you can get relatively quick wins, and a much more ambitious trade integration project could come down the line, but I wouldn't go in front and center with a free trade agreement as the Mauritians are advocating, because I think it's doomed to fail, at least for the foreseeable future. So is there a compelling argument to take it further? I thought that's a great question, and I think it's really linked to the security issues, which are only going to intensify in the Indian Ocean. So for me, trade and security do go together. We live in a geo-economic world. I think everything that the US is doing now vis-a-vis its trade agenda needs to be seen through the lens of geoeconomics. And that is also finding its way into the Indian Ocean, and its expression is the Indo-Pacific strategy. So what we are starting to see is the dialogue partners stepping up their engagement with the IORA Secretariat, with the IORA members, and I think it's just a matter of time before more funding flows, more ambitious projects develop, and the group acquires a greater currency. Now, whether that's going to satisfy a sovereign analyst or not, I doubt, but that is the direction of travel, it seems to me. And then the role of digital trade and services, so we didn't look specifically at that, but it's a good question. There are, and of course it's an important other point to make, there are many other initiatives outside of the IORA space that matter and should just be incorporated. So the e-commerce or digital trade negotiations in the WTO, for example, we think that IORA member states should engage with that. But that happens in Geneva, it doesn't happen in Port Louis. Yeah, so... Well, I think I did. So that was on the new scramble for Africa and whether African states... Yeah. Yeah, so again, I think it comes back to your view of the role of trade integration in development. If you think that Nigeria, for instance, needs to be more integrated into global trade flows and not just selling oil, but in a more diversified setting, then probably you should be embracing a more ambitious trade agenda, I would argue. That would be my ideological standpoint. Others would have a different ideological standpoint. So it depends where you come out on this debate, I think. One thing is reasonably clear to me, and that many of the member states that comprise IORA have quite a skeptical view, would probably share the High Commissioner's skepticism about the role of trade and development. That's not my view, it's certainly not the Australian government's view, and I'm pretty sure it's not Singapore's view either. Yeah.
We can squeeze in a few more questions. Quick questions, comments from anybody?
How much of this is driven by the not so invisible elephant in the room, which has been mentioned so far, and that's as a counterweight to China? You mentioned geopolitical exigencies and geoeconomics as a motivating factor.
Well, I think the entire Indo-Pacific framing is not necessarily targeted at China, but it's a response to China's rise. Absolutely, yeah.
The same goes for IORA as well. You say subsumed under that.
Well, yes and no. I mean, China is a big factor, looming ever larger, but different states are positioned differently when it comes to relations with China. So India has a very particular setting, I suppose, with that bilateral relationship, but East African states are in a different position and would take a different view, probably. Yeah.
You mentioned some states that were excluded or that are not members, but you were not quite explicit on that. I was just going to ask, is there any specific reasons that you could adduce for that? And do you think they could join or they could become members in future?
So I don't know the specific reasons. IORA is about 22 years old, by the way, so it's a relatively new grouping. Some seem to me could be fairly obvious, but I'm speculating. I don't know the answer to this. So why isn't Pakistan there? Possibly because India doesn't want Pakistan in the grouping. I don't know. I don't know the history of it. But the fact is that they're not in the grouping. So maybe when the grouping was first set up, the other side of the equation, maybe Pakistan just wasn't interested. I'm not sure. So I haven't delved into the history of why those states are not included. I've just focused on the fact that it's an obvious gap. And if they can be included in a security-focused structure, why not in an economic cooperation organization?
Hi. Yeah. My name is Yaman. I'm an intern at the NFA. So I just wanted to ask, I think some of the questions that have been voiced today have sort of reflected an awareness of the fact that our global economy is gradually seeing a rise in like protectionistic sentiments, and also you mentioned just now that different countries are growing at different rates, and so there may be cause for concern for less developed states as to whether or not they may be exploited. So my question is, even though you've highlighted certain possible benefits and opportunities that may arise from like further economic integration, do you think it's realistic, and do you think that in the upcoming years, do you think that this is a dream that is going to be realized, or if it's just a lofty ideal? Yeah.
Collective questions that you want to ask.
Thank you, Professor, for your the thoughts that you have put up. My question is, you mentioned about these global value chains, operating in the region. Now, we can see that the graph that you showed, basic raw materials, energy movements on the oceans, whereas the value-added goods will be moving on the landscape. Say now the BRI connects the Asia with the landmass to Europe. Okay, so what do you think, will the value-added services will supersede the trade patterns in the whole world trade? And the second question is, now there's a question of leadership in the IORA. So, and we are also mentioning about the Indo-Pacific. So should Indo-Pacific should take the lead in driving IORA as well, in the absence of one or two nations taking the lead in the IORA?
Yes, sir, please.
I'm not here as an individual. I'm a Singaporean who has traveled a great deal. India, the West, America, China. I may be asking a very naive question in this room, political question. I do not understand why, Professor Peter said that one of the things that is a reaction to the rise of China, right? I do not understand, I may be naive, I don't understand why the rise of China should be confronted with, because for once you see that there is great increase in the capacity of the world to serve humanity, right? China is the country that has successfully eradicated poverty, right? And that will add to the capacity of the world to deal with more issues. So why should that be a reaction to that rise? Especially when look at the map of the IORA, they so convoluted, so just like the horse running with the frame, right? So I'm very skeptical, and I'm also very concerned. Is this a peace initiative, or is this security in the world, right? And that is dangerous to me.
Thank you. Any further questions from anybody? Peter, if that's not sufficient for you, I wanted to add one question from my side. And this is just to come back to a slide that you used in the beginning, which had a tantalizing heading. RCEP as China's, FTA for BRI. Now, I'm just trying to connect a few dots here. India has not joined the RCEP till now. It might not. The doors are open, but the domestic politics might be very stubborn in this regard. One of the outcomes of India not joining RCEP has been a very recent comment by the chief negotiator of Japan, saying that if India doesn't join, Japan will reconsider its decision to be a part of RCEP. Now, I'm just visualizing an extreme possibility where the RCEP goes ahead, at least for the time being, without India and Japan, which substantially alters the balance of the trade agreement across the oceans and the spaces that it covers. And in that case, without India and Japan, do you fancy RCEP actually becoming a more potent vehicle for China to push it as an FTA for BRI? We have got enough for you to ruminate over the evening, so we'll give you 5 minutes to dispense off with all these distressing queries.
Oh, good questions and observations. It is a challenging grouping to think about. It really is. So we knew what we were taking on. So will the IORA opportunity, trade integration opportunity, be realized in an increasingly geopolitical and protectionist world, if I understood the question correctly? Good question. I don't have a stock answer to that question. What I would observe is that the security interest in the region is rising, and I'll get on to should we see China as a threat or not shortly. Because that interest is rising, the institutions, the states respond, and they respond. Always trade is one of the instruments in the toolbox that states reach for. So I see the interest in trade continuing to escalate across the IORA member states. Whether that results in a grand free trade agreement or a patchwork of, I don't know, it wouldn't be a noodle bowl or a spaghetti bowl, I don't know what we'd call it, but patchwork of agreements across the Indian Ocean region, that's already starting to emerge, I would argue, actually, with Indonesia's interest in the East African community, for instance. And India's been negotiating a preferential trade agreement with SACU, the Southern African Customs Union, for more than a decade. I'm not sure where that process has gone. So the interest in trade is going to continue to grow. I don't see that going away. And so Singapore needs to engage with that. And the question is, how is Singapore going to engage with that? Right, the question about value-added goods and their transportation modalities, if I understood it correctly. So, per my understanding, most of world trade is carried by sea, and that tends to be the bulk items. But if you think container shipping, that's a lot of value-added trade that's caught up just on the oceans. And yes, by rail, a lot of value-added trade does move, but it pales into insignificance compared to container shipping by ocean. And there's a very small proportion that is carried by air, but that's very high-value, low-weight goods, so electronic components, for instance. Right now, that kind of trade I don't see taking off in certainly the western part, if you like, the Eastern African littoral states. But there's something interesting starting to happen in Ethiopia particularly, which is attracting more and more of this kind of labor-intensive, export-oriented manufacturing investment. And so one can visualize the geese flying from China to Vietnam, Cambodia, Bangladesh, and lastly into the eastern part of Africa, where the conditions are starting to become ripe for that kind of investment, right as the fourth industrial revolution is taking shape, which threatens that labor-intensive model, I would argue. So I do worry about the long-term future development potential of those East African states, but that's another story, and I'm not sure I've answered the question, but just to understand the modalities right. And then the leadership questions again, it strikes me, if I were to put up that BRI map again, oops, let me just quickly find it, because I think it's, we've all seen it, but it tells a very interesting story from an Indian perspective, particularly, because to me, India is the natural leader of IORA, and probably has the biggest stake. So here's that map. Or not? There we are. So the map on the right-hand side does look a little bit like encirclement. right? And that has been the Indian strategic concern, I think, that China is encircling India somehow through its string of pearls, investment in all these naval bases along the maritime road particularly, but also the corridor, the economic corridor with Pakistan, the corridor with Myanmar. So to the extent that India feels encircled, it needs to break out of that encirclement. And where's it going to break out? It's going to be into the Indian Ocean region, it seems to me. And there's only one country with the capacity to act as a counterweight to India, to China in a geopolitical sense, and that's India. Which is why the major Western powers, including Australia, are courting India under this Indo-Pacific strategy. So that's not a secret. But it does seem to me leadership is going to come from India and maybe Indonesia in the medium term. Whether these two countries are ready for it, I don't think they are yet. But it's just a matter of time, in my view, before they need to step up. Now, whether the Indian system, and particularly its trade policy approaches, can tolerate that is another matter entirely, and certainly not for the foreseeable future, the way I see it. And I think Indonesia is in a similar position, which is why leadership traditionally has been left to Australia, which is quite a reluctant leader in this space because it is the only developed country in the IORA grouping. And it's reluctant to step too far ahead. So it looks for support to Singapore, which is a developed country, even though in the WTO it's not self-classifying as a developed country, it self-classifies as a developing country. But it does strike me that an Australia-Singapore partnership in the IORA context makes a lot of sense. And I would add to that another small middle power, which is Mauritius, that has a very strong stake in building Indian Ocean connectivity. And I read a very interesting statistic on the plane. Apparently, in terms of sources of FDI into India, Mauritius is now the second largest source. So that's quite an extraordinary figure if you think about it. And obviously, there's cultural connections to that, but also Mauritius acts as one of those gateways, an offshore center. So RCEP minus Japan, does it become China's vehicle? Well, I think firstly, RCEP minus Japan would make the ASEAN states very nervous. So I'm not sure that's a realistic proposition for starters. I think the ASEAN states want everybody on board. So they definitely want India in, and China, and Japan. Australia and New Zealand, I think, are less important, but certainly those three big players. So if Japan pulls out, I don't know what that means for RCEP or how the ASEAN states would respond. But I don't see Japan pulling out. And I do see India coming on board at some point, if they can get what they need from Beijing, which I suspect
We'll have you coming back to speak on that after a few months.
Sure.
Lovely, Peter. Thank you. Thank you so much. It's been an engrossing discussion. Thank you so much for taking us through this large number of issues. Thanks to everybody for the very interesting questions and comments raised. And please join me in thanking Professor Peter Draper for the seminar he delivered. And there are some refreshments outside, tea and coffee, so please join us. We can continue the conversation over tea and coffee. Thank you.